Um, just a forewarning, this is the first time I'm Zooming with the Wi-Fi where I'm staying, and it's a little bit subpar. So if I cut out, if you have trouble hearing me, just let me know, and maybe I'll try turning my video off, and that might improve the sound. Um, First of all, on the point that Tunisia was really the one successful democracy in the region, it's true with caveats. Of course, Tunisia came farther in building its own organic democracy than any other country in the Middle East or North Africa. Even countries that have been hailed as comparatively democratic at various points in their recent history, like Turkey, like Lebanon, etc. Tunisia was the only country among all of these that was able to meet what political scientists understand to be the minimum requirements to qualify as a democracy. Things like multiple free and fair elections with peaceful transfers of power, establishing a system of checks and balances that's pretty functional, etc. But just because Tunisia met those minimum requirements to be considered a democracy, according to Freedom House, Polity 4, and most political scientists who work on democratization, doesn't, of course, mean that Tunisia's young democracy, which was only it first experienced its birth pains in 2011, was consolidated, was strong, etc. Tunisia was, of course, a very new, fresh, flawed, and fragile democracy. And average Tunisians felt that. They felt the governmental dysfunction. They felt the lack of accomplishment of their elected leaders in forging a vision that could bring tangible benefits on the economy, corruption, security sector reform, and other issues that many Tunisians feel beleaguered by, and indeed felt beleaguered by before the revolution of 2011 too. So that's just to clarify and caveat, what was at stake and what was being lost. It's important to recognize that despite its fragility and despite its flaws, which were manifold, Tunisia had an extraordinary symbolic heft. I think Tunisia, for its size, probably had the most symbolic political importance, arguably, of any country in the globe, over much of the past decade. Why? Because it was the first organic democracy in the Arab world, and that meant a lot for all Arabs, of course, but also for people outside the region. It's easy to forget about Tunisia and to get lost in the mire of a lot of the governmental dysfunction and challenges over the past decade, and forget what was actually at stake and what's being lost right now, what's being obliterated systematically by Kais Saied. Is the coup going to be permanent if Kais gets his way on July 25th, as it seems he likely will? Well, for a while, yes. At least in the near term, yes. The July 25th referendum is going to, if it passes by hook or by crook, it's going to instantiate his coup regime in a more permanent way than we've seen before. Of course, over the past year, since Kais Saied made his auto golpe or presidential coup on July 25th, we've seen a systematic attack on all elements of democratic checks and balance, freedom of expression, to criticize, etc., due process, and more. Many of these, were somewhat under threat before, with the failure of security sector reform in Tunisia and the failure to create a constitutional court and harmonize the authoritarian era legislation with the wonderful aspirations of the 2014 constitution. But nothing compares to what we've seen since July 25th. It's been a systematic assault. And I'll spare everyone the list, belaboring the laundry list of that assault, because I think most of us in the audience are familiar with that. But this is going to, July 25th stands to make things more permanent. Will it succeed? Will Kais get his way in this referendum? It looks likely, for a few reasons. Number one, it's rare that presidents who obliterate checks and balance and take power in coup or coup-like scenarios, hold referendums only to lose them. Said has also manipulated the process. And, as Said and I think Najib both mentioned, EASY, the elections watchdog, has been taken over by Said, just as the High Judicial Council was. It's been gutted, dismantled, and then reconstituted with lackeys and yes people. So that, those two things alone, in terms of context and process, give a lot of reason for us to think it unlikely that he would go through all this not to get his way. A third very important reason that we've alluded to is that people who feel very strongly that this was a coup and that Tunisia is headed in the wrong direction are by and large going to simply not vote. They're going to boycott instead of voting no. And it's quite an ethical conundrum for a lot of Tunisians to think through. Do I go out and vote no, given that there's no minimum threshold for Said's referendum? He could force it through and say that he had a strong majority, maybe even majority. Kais, said such things, or that he has strong legitimacy based on turnout that's 10% or less. He did something similar with the e-istishara earlier this year, where the turnout barely scraped 6%, according to their own official figures. And he trumped that up into a mandate to hold this constitutional referendum. So there's no minimum threshold, which, for some Tunisians is an argument to actually go out and vote no. But there's so much distaste with the whole process. There's such a strong feeling on the street amongst people who are critical and feel the country's headed in the wrong direction, that the process isn't free or fair. And if there are queues outside of polling places, those photo ops are just going to give him added grist for his propaganda mill. And they don't want to be part of that. So for all those reasons, I think it's quite likely that that Kayas's solely authored authoritarian constitution is going to pass by hook or crook on July 25th. We have to keep in mind that even if it wasn't a dictatorial dog's breakfast of a draft constitution, even if it was very well worded and articulate and espoused higher democratic aspirations, which it most certainly doesn't, that the process alone, the context in which all of this is coming down, is one of dictatorial consolidation that's happening apace. So it's important, I think some people have gotten their needles a bit stuck on exactly what the Constitution will or won't say, or this draft does or doesn't say, and they lose sight of the fact that the entire process is completely illegitimate. Tunisians were not clamoring for a new constitution. Tunisians have been clamoring for affordable foodstuffs. They've been clamoring for jobs. And they've been desperate to see better infrastructure and to overcome things like sugar shortages, oil shortages, flour shortages, to just make ends meet. So this has been said before, but I'll say it again. Kais Saied is repeating more dramatically a mistake that a lot of his predecessors made, especially in the most recent 5-7 years since the 2014 constitution was finalized, which is focusing on politics and people's own personal political aspirations and fetishes almost, at the cost of concentrating on what most Tunisians care about, and a vision for the country and a program for the country that can deliver bread and butter issues that Tunisians really care about. And the failure to deliver on those issues is why Tunisians lost faith, a lot of them lost faith in the democracy, at least to the extent that it was represented by the pre-July 25th parliament. And Kais runs similar risks. However, he's relying on support from the Ministry of Interior, from the military, and from a manipulated, gutted, desiccated judicial ministry. So manipulated judges, yes, people judges. And this bears a lot of resemblance to the Bourguiba and Ben Ali regimes. They relied on the exact same pillars of power, broadly speaking. Most Tunisians feel tired, exhausted. A lot of people feel almost they have an air of zombification about them, or seeming paralyzed, just sleepwalking into this, saying, inshallah, on July 25th, whatever happens, come what may, hopefully things will settle down and it'll be better then. So I think a lot of people, just because they're so tired or because of the pandemic, the economy, whatever factor of reasons, or because they got their hopes up in the past for political reconfigurations that they believe failed to deliver, there's a lot of exhaustion. And most people seem to be, their worry levels, a lot of people I've spoken with, not everybody, of course, but many average Tunisians seem to be at about like a 3 or a 4 when I, and I think most political scientists, especially people who focused on constitution building, democratization, de-democratization, believe that they need to be at a 9 or a 10. I think that July 25th, far from settling things, is going to thrust open the gates of dictatorial abuses even more in Tunisia. Already we're seeing some signs that Kais is chomping at the bit to use these newly instantiated powers to silence more opposition. Just yesterday, Rashid Ghannouchi, the leader of the center-right Ennahda party, his bank account was frozen. Today, there was news out that he's being summoned by counterterrorism on counterterrorism charges again. And it's impossible, of course, with no due process or checks and balances or judicial independence to say whether any of these charges are politically motivated from Kais Saied or have any merit whatsoever. Nobody has seen the evidence of these cases. Noureddin Bahiri, a very prominent member of the Ennahda opposition party, the same party as Ghannouchi, as we know, he was held what's the word? He was held without any due process. He was basically kidnapped and held for 2 months, and then he was released, and there was no evidence given. And he was also held on terrorism charges. People have of course been hauled before military courts with no evidence for seemingly the explicit purpose of silencing them. We're also in a strange situation now where we're just a couple weeks out of the most important political decision that Tunisians allegedly, if there's, if things are free and fair, or, well, I mean, the process can't be free and fair, but if the counting at least is, that Tunisians have the opportunity to make, we're in a strange situation where the country's most popular political television show, Midi show on Mosaic FM, isn't even airing. Why is that? Well, that's because the channel Mosaic FM, which has been quite critical of Kais Saied, has been intimidated. They've been threatened with closure and fines. And they've taken their journalists who are, speaking on MIDI show, and they've sent them all home for vacation. This is the situation we're dealing with. There's also chatter about Kais potentially trying to take over UGTT, removing Taboubi, coercing, co-opting the national leadership of UGTT, which might go some way to explaining, along with other factors, to explaining their tendency to waffle on Kais. UGTT told their supporters, you can vote yes, you can vote no. They're not taking a clear line. And UGTT, itself is afraid that the government might cut the 1% of funding that public servants automatically go from public servants' paychecks to the union. The government, meaning Kais Saied himself, has the power to do that. Taboubi might be afraid for his own position inside UGTT because of threats from Kais, etc. So, these are just a handful of ways that he's poised to do much more than he's done so far. I'll end here. Radwan, you asked about the future for democracy in Tunisia. Is it done and dusted? Sadly, in the short term, I think likely yes. Tunisia, technically speaking, hasn't been a democracy since July 25th of last year. It's been a dictatorship, if you define dictatorship as a form of government in which one person, without any meaningful oversight, makes decisions by decree, rules by fiat. That's exactly what Tunisia has been for the past year. And July 25th looks likely to inscribe that even further. However, does that mean that Tunisians don't want democracy, or that these aspirations are all lost to the wind and the entire experience of the past 10 years is going to be forgotten? No, it's important to take a long view of history. So often history does not move in a linear fashion. There are one step forward and three steps back kind of thing often happens. And great progress, great strides, great leaps and bounds might not be possible without prior strides that looked like they had failed in the moment. How Tunisians remember the experiment of the past 10 years will make a huge difference, and only Tunisians can answer that. I've seen some Tunisians just in the past year start using the phrase Black Decade in Arabic to describe the situation since 2011, which for those of us familiar with the actual Black Decade in Algeria in the 1990s, seems like quite a bit of hyperbole, given that was a civil war in which many people were killed, over 100,000. Nothing of the sort has happened in Tunisia. What you've had is flailing government that hasn't delivered on bread and butter issues that most people care about, and a lot of self-interest at the top, but also a lot of challenges that are quite typical to democratic transitions. That's why tooting my own horn a little bit here, comparative political science is important. It's important to study the comparative experiences in democratic transitions. There's often what economists and political scientists call a J curve, where things get a lot worse before they get better. And in many ways, Tunisia seemed to get into that U of the J curve and not really be able to extract itself. But this phrase, the Black Decade, it shows that there's a segment of Tunisians, encouraged, of course, by Kais Saied and forces internally and outside Tunisia that are supporting him, to use this phrase and to write off the experience as something just horrific, something almost unmentionable, the Black Decade. But whether most Tunisians are actually going to remember it that way come 5 years from now remains to be seen. And a lot of that turns on Kais Saied himself, and to the extent that he manages to deliver on these same bread and butter issues that most Tunisians care about. And it seems that he is so fixated and he so fetishizes these quirky, esoteric, Gaddafi-esque political dreams that, like Saied said before me, he's very consistent with this. He's very consistently fixated, almost tunnel visioned. It seems unlikely that he's really going to be able to deliver on much else, because we know that systems with rather unhinged leaders at the top and no checks and balances don't tend to be the most efficient or stable. And B, Saied just doesn't seem to be interested.